I am glad there's a ceasefire that the Ukrainians want to make work. But I remain deeply concerned because the reality is it's not the Ukrainians who caused this war. So they're not the ones who have to be convinced to stop fighting. It's the Russians. And, none of us have heard anything from Putin or from any of his acolytes or even from some of his outriders on this. Now, what we do know is that some of the more right-wing, the sort of Russian Orthodox right-wing websites are already suggesting that a betrayal is on its way, which, does suggest that Putin might have problems delivering a ceasefire with his more nationalist elements. But let's see. I mean, the reality is we want this war to stop. We want the killing to stop. We want, people to get back to their lives and for people to stop being killed in their beds.
But again, a lot of it does determine, is determined by the terms of any deal. Now, Marco Rubio has said today that he said we have had discussions on territorial concessions in Ukraine. He said the US hopes to have a positive answer on the ceasefire from Russia. Speaking in Ireland, he said they're urging Russia to end all hostilities so people will stop dying, so bullets will stop flying, so there is no military solution to this conflict. I mean, personally, I think that's utter tosh. Of course, there's a military solution, which is the West giving Ukraine enough aid that they can oust their invaders. But there we are. I'm
going to interrupt you for a second, Julia, just to say I keep hearing there is no military solution to a conflict. What do you think the Second World War ended with?
Yeah,
it ended with a military solution. What do wars regularly end with military solutions. That's how many of them end, actually. And this whole sort of Corbyn type line that there's got to be a peace talk. No, the people who are being murdered should have the right to defend themselves and stop other people murdering.
Absolutely. Well, again, when we've had Donald Trump characterising Zelensky as dictator and the one who's a warmonger as opposed to Vladimir Putin, I mean, then we've got a very topsy-turvy world. But there is the difficulty, isn't it, in terms of what is Zelensky going to have to agree in return for a ceasefire deal. We know this mineral deal. I mean, frankly, at this point, neither here nor there. Fine, have the minerals. But they want the guarantee from either the Americans or rather the Americans plus the European countries. But if it doesn't look like the Americans, then the coalition of the willing that Starmer and Macron are putting together. But we've heard from the Russians, from what has been said, that they would never put up with any NATO troops from any NATO country in Ukraine. They also would like demand no NATO accession for Ukraine. That's pretty much off the cards. America's made that clear. But also they'd want some sort of legal recognition, international recognition that, Crimea and the Donbass are now Russian territory. That is something surely that not only Ukraine cannot agree to, but also the West cannot agree to, because it's basically a big win for Donald Trump at that point.
Well, look, we've got to be careful here, Julia. We can't be more Catholic than the Pope, right? If the Ukrainians can live with it, it's up to them. It's not up to us. They're not, I know Russia wants to make them into a colony, but we don't. We want them to be a sovereign and independent state. And if they can live with territorial concessions, that's up to them. It's not up to me. It's not up to anybody else. It's up to the sovereign people of Ukraine and their government and their organization. Right. The next question really is, what should we be pushing them to do? Now, my argument is very clear. We should be making sure that they have the appropriate latitude to negotiate, to make sure that their people are safe. Now, that doesn't mean I want to escalate, but it also means I don't want to accept or tolerate that Russia has some sort of veto over sovereign states, as though they're sort of semi-colonies. If a country wishes to join a trade agreement or a political alliance or a defensive alliance, it's up to them. I mean, many people didn't like the fact that we voted to leave the European Union, but that was just up to us. Nobody else got to say on that. We decided to leave, and we could have decided to stay. We decided to join NATO. We could have decided not to. This is what sovereign countries do. They decide to join or to leave different organizations. If the Ukrainians want to join NATO or the EU or anything else, and the other parties want to accept them, it's none of Russia's business. This whole rubbish that the people on the left, and in fact, sadly, some conspiracy theorists on the right now are spreading about NATO expanding, it's complete rubbish.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because we had a caller making that point. I get this constantly on social media now that, it was NATO pushing its way into Ukraine, again, as if it wasn't Ukraine saying, oh, can we have your help, please? We're worried about the threat from Russia. But the idea that was a provocation, and basically it's all Ukraine's fault, and it's all NATO's fault, it's all the EU's fault, and Putin wouldn't be a threat if he didn't himself feel threatened. What would you say to that?
It's total rubbish. I mean, it's total rubbish, and it's completely factually wrong. You can look at the history. In 2007, Putin kidnapped two border guards from Estonia. In 2008, he ordered the invasion and occupation of parts of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, still occupied since 2008. Around that time, people in Ukraine were so disappointed by the level of corruption in their government by Kremlin sponsored oligarchs that you started to see this pressure to look west rather than to look east. Now, at that point, there wasn't really any talk about joining NATO, but there was talk about cooperating with the European Union. And that was stamped on so hard that we remember the Orange Revolution, as it was called, that was really stamped on very hard by pro-Kremlin apparatchiks who fired into the crowd and killed various people. Now, at that point, unsurprisingly, people felt even more threatened by Russia. And guess what? As they felt more threatened by Russia, they decided to look for support. Now, where do you look for support? You look for support from your neighbours. What's your neighbours' support group called? It's called NATO. Yeah. So they joined NATO, or sorry, they started to talk about joining NATO for exactly the same reason as Finland and Sweden did. Look, Finland and Sweden were neutral for 80 years, right? They didn't want to. They wanted to stay neutral. But because of what Russia has done, because of what Putin has done, they were left with no choice. So the idea that NATO is expanding, NATO, there isn't a thing, NATO. It's not an empire. It's not it's not an organization. It's not a state. It's not expanding. Free countries are freely associating with other free countries for protection. We call that standing together NATO. You can call it whatever you like, but that's all it is. It's free standing together.
Are you convinced that if Russia did feel that it got away with its actions in Ukraine, although again, still an abject failure, people are talking about Ukraine winning. I mean, I'm sorry, about Russia winning when 3 years on they've taken, another 10% of the country. They already had Crimea in 2014. I mean, that they're over a much smaller state, a huge military might of Russia, and they can't even take Ukraine, for goodness sake. But even if they do take a big slice of Ukrainian territory, if they decide to move on to another nation, are you fully sure that the Article 5 of the NATO treaty, where we would actually, attack on one is attack on all, that America, that the other countries in Europe would come to the aid of a country like, say, Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania if they were attacked by Russia? Because I'm not sure I would trust NATO anymore.
So, look, let's look at Article 5. An Article 5 commitment is a promise to respond. It doesn't necessarily mean a military response. It can be responding in different ways. Am I certain that NATO countries would choose to support a NATO country that had been attacked? Yes, I am. I'm not in any doubt at all. If Estonia was attacked, I'm in no doubt that Finland, Sweden, Germany, Britain would come to the support of Estonia. Would the United States put in soldiers? Maybe not. Might just provide military support, might just provide weapons and ammunition. It doesn't have to be the same response from everybody. But let's not forget, the only time Article 5 has been invoked was after 9/11. We all came to the aid of the United States. But let's also be clear that, Putin himself was perfectly relaxed about NATO when Russia had observer status in NATO. Putin was perfectly relaxed about NATO when NATO countries clubbed together and assisted in refloating the Russian economy in the 1990s. Let's not pretend that the West has been anti-Russian. It's complete rubbish. We have supported Russia. The problem is people like Putin have destroyed it. You said it was about 10%. Actually, to be fair, the Russians now currently control 19.2%.
No, but I'm saying, but they already had Crimea.
Well, it's actually worse than that, Julia. They now control 19.2. When they invaded, those first few weeks of the invasion, just after February 22, they controlled 19.6%. So in the last 3 years, they've lost 0.4% of Ukraine for the loss of about 700,000 to 800,000 Russians dead and injured. Yeah. Now, if you want to be pro-Russian, and I do, you want this war to end, you want those kids to come home, and you want Russian mothers to be able to look after their sons, because frankly, what Putin is doing is he is murdering Russia, he's destroying the economy, and he's making absolutely true what Brzezinski said back in the 80s. He said Russia has always had a strategic choice. It can be a partner of Europe or a vassal of China. And what Putin has chosen is to be a vassal of China.
Is any deal that Putin might agree to in terms of a 30-day ceasefire and perhaps moving on to something long-term, whatever the terms of that deal are, Is anything that he signs worth the paper it's printed on? Because that was the point Zelensky was making to Donald Trump before he sort of went off on one in the Oval Office, that he's reneged on every agreement he's ever signed in the past. Would you trust anything that he signed or a word that he says?
No, not even slightly. But, this is where, perfectly understandably, President Zelensky is asking for support and possibly military assistance to ensure a ceasefire binds. And, let's not pretend this is some sort of, game of chess where two generals are fighting it out with their armies. Just look at how many people are dying in Ukraine, right? We saw an explosion in a tower block the other day, last night. A woman in her 40s was killed. Her two children were extremely seriously injured, and a further dozen or so people were really seriously injured. We saw a school hit. We saw a hospital hit. This isn't some sort of, World War One fighting in the trenches between soldiers and it's sort of all remote from the civilian population. No, Russia is murdering Ukrainians in their beds. That's what they're doing. And we need to recognize that. So when Zelensky is asking for support, wouldn't we want support to make sure that you and me and others can go about our daily lives peacefully? Wouldn't we want that for our children? Of course we would.
Well, that's the extraordinary thing. What do you make of the proposal for a coalition of the willing and peacekeeping troops once their world's peace? Because, again, the response I get on social media is, oh, well, are you going to go and fight, are you, Julia? Are you going to send your child? Are you, it's all right for people talking about this, but not actually willing to go on the front line themselves. If it was for my own country, absolutely be willing to go on the front line myself. You've been on the front line. What do you make of that proposal?
So, look, it's too early to make any real comments about it, other than I'll say something I don't very often say. I think Keir Starmer's actually done rather well on this. I think he's led well and brought Macron and some of the other Europeans together. I think that is an achievement. Let's see what the detail of the proposal is before we make any final decisions, because it really does depend what's on the table. It depends what are we trying to enforce a ceasefire, or are we trying to just observe one? Are we trying to, deliver aid? Are we trying to, what are we actually trying to do? So let's see what the proposal is before we, make too many comments on it. But I do support the idea that the UK has a contribution to make in keeping Europe safe, because let's not forget, you're quite right to say, by the way, Julia, that of course we'd fight hard for our own home. That's obviously true. But it's also true that NATO is a huge luxury for us. It's effectively a 2,000-mile bumper east and south for us, which means that if any fighting starts, we've got a bit of a tripwire before it gets to us. Now, that is a huge luxury. But in order to have that luxury, countries like Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania need to know that we're with them.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why on earth should they stand up and not see us get steamrolled later, right? So we're in this together, and it's a great luxury for the UK, but it means we have a responsibility too.
Tom Tugendhat, really good to talk to you. So